Hi, this is Travis Marker with America Francis. We're doing Steward Growth in our Readers Book Club. And the rules for our Readers Book Club is that we are not exploring just one topic, but we maybe pick a theme. I mean, we're not picking one book, but we explore more of a theme. And it's March, and we've just gone through St. Patrick's Day. So we thought, well, why don't we explore some Irish literature? Um,
Do
one,
they have Scottish literature?
Yeah, there's Scottish literature, but I mean, you actually bring up a good point that I was thinking about is, um, I think that the Irish literature is a little bit more predominant because of the identity of their resistance for so long and their battles for so long. And I would think, like historically, the Scots were definitely rebellious. I mean, they have like we have William Wallace, we have Robert the Bruce, we have Rob Roy. There is some interesting stories that come out of Scotland, but I don't think that they predominate our literature as much because they don't represent like rebellion, where the Irish being kicked out from, or the Irish famine and the Irish suppression and then just the perpetual Irish wars. And I think also the things that come up with like Irish music, like with YouTube, but also Enya that are kind of like more pop in nature, but then there's more folk Irish. And I think that you don't have just vast neighborhoods of Scottish in like the United States. There almost seems to be a little bit more of a camaraderie connected to the Irish community because of the mutual oppression, but also just that identity of Protestant, Catholic, and just what side were they on and where they're at. And so I was thinking the other day because I was wondering, why isn't there like we don't have a Scottish holiday that is like a really big deal that we have a Scottish parade, but and Bing Crosby doesn't sing a whole bunch of Scottish songs. He has a whole Irish book. And I just think that their identity and culture is a lot more vivid because of the role they've played by way of being oppressed. And it's not a joke that they've been oppressed. I think as I do family history for different people, I mean, I have Scottish connection. I mean, I have some Scottish. I also have more Irish, and the Irish literally disappear at times because of the way the bombings have handled their records and the, just oppressions handled their records and churches have handled their records or been burned. And so, it's not often that I would say European culture has very many areas where they might just disappear. I think you do see it with Jewish because of the oppression that the Jewish have had. You'll also see it in like areas that are kind of war torn, but when I go to Scandinavia and I'm searching Danish records, they're fairly unmolested.
Mm.
Like I can I can get a lot of Danish records or a lot of Swedish records or a lot of Norwegian records, like lots and lots and lots of English records. But when it comes, and I think even when the English, like for example, when the Irish would go from Ireland into England and live in London, then all of a sudden they'd show up and they'd have all their records again. But I think it's really a difficult story when we talk about the Irish because of the role they have played in history and the role they've kind of endured and suffered in history and the things that have been subject to that. So, but I've had a lot of fun with the Irish literature. There is a lot of fun Irish literature, and it also takes on a couple different personalities depending on the class of where the person fit in society,
Hmm.
which is also unique because I have a friend here in Ogden that grew up in England outside of London, and she was technically middle class-ish,
How
and
many classes even are there, Travis? There isn't
the,
like lower and middle and upper. It's like 12 deep or something.
yeah, I don't even know, but it's very stratosphere. Like there is definitely a
It's
class
like
system.
India.
Yeah, well, apparently it's even I don't know if it's as rigid or more rigid, but it's definitely very apparent, that for this individual I know here, she knows if she goes to England, she knows where she fits immediately based upon her language, based upon like her accent, her dialect, based upon her economic experiences, based upon her education, where
There are lots of clubs you cannot go in.
yeah. So
Neighborhood.
right. So when we come to the United States, we say middle class. That doesn't necessarily mean anything to us other than, you can go to the store and buy what you want or whatever. Then there's like lower middle class, or maybe your budget's a little tighter. Then there's like lower middle class, well, you probably on welfare, maybe you had some intergenerational poverty, but they don't represent to us, and I can't marry you, or I can't associate with you, or I can't date you, or like our bloodlines are going to be totally messed up and people are going to be not rolling in their graves. They're going to be like throwing their graves around, this is, I cannot take this
This
anymore.
cannot be done. We are Romeo and Juliet here.
Yeah. So it's fun to read Irish literature from the perspective of trying to also understand the classes that exist for in the Irish system, which I think are different from the British system, but they're kind of it's still similar because they're aware of where they fit. Like recently, I just read. Uh, Let me see if I can. I'll pull up the book I just read. It was fun.
Do you have several different, I don't know if genre is the right word, but if there's Irish literature, do you have like 6 types of cultural literature that you go back to? Or is it like, I'm trying to even wrap my head around studying Irish literature as a thing.
Oh, okay. Well, I think what I do is I do have themes in the year where I will explore books and I will
Are they different?
yeah. So like uh for example, March is would be an Irish book, right? But then in um
Do you have more than one per month? Or do you only have 12? Or do you have based on holidays and not so much months?
yeah, it's kind of like themes like, when I see things pop up like, like it, female history month, I'll try to pick some female books. If in then there's like the in May is Asian Pacific Heritage Month. So I'll try to read some, Asian Pacific type books, if I'm it's just kind of like, and then in October I usually read some Halloween books. If there's, it's not like the entire month that's all I read, but
Well, how many books are you going through in a month again? Are you reading 10 books a month?
sometimes I'm not uh
You
I,
listen to
I'm
books every day.
I do every day. I have 36 books that I finished this year, which is slower than last year. Um, and so it just kind of depends. Like right now, I'm reading an Agatha Christie book, and then there were none.
Okay.
And then I'm reading The Kindness Diaries, that guy. I can't remember his name. But,
I have Go Be Kind in the other room. Do
yeah, yeah,
you
go be.
start one before you finish another one?
Oh no, I read right now. I'm reading at night. I rotate between 9 books. And I'll read like 4 to 5 pages out of each book, or a little bit longer if one of them is just kind of interesting, or um,
Wait. Every night you read 3 to 4 pages of one book, and you switch every night among 9, or you read several books, 3 to 4 pages.
so I'll read 5 books a night, and I'll read around 4 to 5 pages out of each book.
Ooh, that's cool.
And then like some of it is a little bit some of it is fiction, some of it's nonfiction, some of it's potentially philosophy based, some of it might be even just religious philosophy or so I just kind of have a collective sampling of books I read. So the one that I read recently that was interesting was called The Outside Boy by Jeannie Cummins. And I've looked a little bit on her, and she's interesting because she doesn't write just Irish literature. She's written some, she writes outside of her genre of, like, she doesn't stay in just one genre. But The Outside Boy was unique because it talks about Irish gypsies. And I didn't know that in Ireland, Scotland, and England, they have they're they're white gypsies. Like the
Are they okay with being called gypsies?
no, they're not called gypsies. They're called it's Pavee, so Pavi, or they're called tinkers because they wander from area to area. At one point, they had in this story they have like a gypsy concept where they have a horse and a trailer, like a or a wagon,
Uh-huh.
and they have progressed. So they're not. I don't think they. I mean, some of them now have like mobile homes, like caravans. But the
Hmm.
idea was is that they had inclinations towards animals, so they might be like a horse doctor or a veterinarian, or they would also be the tinker, which is the metal work. So they'll do work around the houses and things. But then they are nomadic in nature.
Okay.
And I didn't know that I didn't know that that's existed, and they're considered to be somewhat indigenous in nature,
Okay.
and which is
Well, are
another
they
interesting.
originally from Great Britain or not?
Yeah, the indigenous, right? They're somehow considered indigenous. Like they have evolved as a people, but then that's interesting because gypsies are somewhat indigenous to Hungary and parts of Europe,
Romania.
yeah, Romania. And so the fact that there's this indigenous population that's somewhat nomadic that's interesting, right? So I'll try to find books like that. Another one I just finished was Finnegan O'Reilly, an Irish doctor by Taylor Patrick.
Do
And
we
this
have a Goodreads for Stewart Growth yet?
not specifically, but if people go to Scrivener's Quill, that's where I put my books. And this is
Mhm.
a carryover from doing the conferences that I did. And the Finnegan O'Reilly was interesting because these are people who are going to like a guy who becomes a doctor. And in Ireland, they have socialized medicine so that the state pays for people to be provided medicine, right? And so the doctors are assigned to clinics that the state's paying for, and then they just go into the neighborhoods and people come to them and they handle it. And so this Finnegan O'Reilly is assigned to uh, the equivalent of slums. They don't call them slums um, outside of the Dublin area, and they're really interesting. They're really interesting stories because you're talking about the social class, and they're very aware of the social class. You're also talking about the dole or people being on the social welfare and how it works differently. Also in Ireland and Australia, they had the dole also, and
Hmm.
Scotland has the dole, and England has the dole, but it works differently than in the U.S. So you're dealing with some of those issues. You also see some of the things that appear to be stereotypical, but they're being written by an Irish person. So the problem with alcohol and alcoholism, and just how do people deal with poverty and how do they overcome poverty. So,
When was that book written?
two when was it written?
Yeah. It was by a modern author.
Yes, and it was first written in it looks like for 2013. But the context of this one is um, it's between World War I and World War II. So they're also talking about issues with Irish sympathies towards fascism in Spain, as well as towards the nationalists and the Republicans. So there's the nationalists and Republicans in Spain, but now they're also dealing with what role is Hitler going to play in history, and because of the role Ireland is facing politically with England, you have the tension between some of the Irish feeling sympathetic towards um, different sides of the conflict in very complex ways. But the author of this book is telling it in a very humanistic community type way, right? So it's not from a highbrow story. It's just the sense of, how do communities deal with interturmoil, with particularly when they're dealing with poverty and class issues, and the Irish on the lower side of the class issues. So it was fun to just see the Irish from a different perspective.
Did you eat any Irish food?
Yeah, we often have corned beef and cabbage and potatoes and carrots. We did not have it specifically on, you know, St. Patrick's Day this year. We had it a little bit before because my daughters like corned beef, and so they wanted it early.
Yeah, I like it too.
Yeah, another one was interesting is so there's a guy named it's Eoin, so Owen Colfer. He writes a really fun juvenile series. Um, one sec, let me tell you what it is. It's a really fun juvenile series in which Artemis Fowl is the series. Are you familiar with this at all?
I've heard the name, but I don't know how much of the story I'm familiar with.
Yeah, they're interesting and they're a little bit crude and because they're kind of written for elementary, like early junior high. So there's like farting and stuff like that. So sometimes you're like, I mean, it's not it's not perfect, but it's this Artemis Fowl ends up engaged with like fairies and all these other different people, but it's kind of like it's written in a modern context where there's also technology. So it's funny to have um these things happening where you have a computer, but you're also have a fairy involved, right?
Yeah,
So it's a blending of the metaphysical, like mythical, with um just with what's happening in fairyland as well as what's happening in this other modern stuff. So they're pretty clever. They're very funny, but they are definitely
I I've
they're
seen some movies that are like that, and I'm trying to figure out if it was that story or a different one that's similar. But
Oh, I think there is an Artemis Fowl movie. I think there was an Artemis Fowl movie.
mhm.
So, but Owen Clofer also writes a book called Plugged, in which he's talking about Irish people living in New Jersey who are part of underground crime and drugs and prostitution and like criminal activity and police activity, which is also another interesting element of Irish literature is the idea that they don't necessarily consider being in the United States different than being in Ireland. It's like Ireland bled over, like because the communities will go
The
back and
rules don't apply to them the same way because they're still Irish.
right, and their communities don't necessarily really change. So there's a lot of Irish American societies who they are organized to take care of their parents back home or their families back home or their political issues back home or their
Hmm.
but
They
then
stay
you'll have
connected.
but you'll have both sides. So like you'll have Protestant Irish and you also have Catholic Irish and they're both so like during a lot of the Irish conflict in Ireland, during the 90s, the United States was in conflict because it recognized it had supporters like adamant, diehard, financially successful supporters on both sides of the Irish issue. So the United States was being encouraged to play a role, but they couldn't they had to be careful because they had clear Irish, advocates on both sides.
Hmm.
so, so when you talk about this book, Plugged by Owen Colfer, it happening in New Jersey, um, people in the book had relatives in Ireland and they would play it into the plot. And one of the guys in the book is a former Irish special forces person, and he had people in Ireland who could play leverage positions against the guys in the Jersey like mafia and stuff, Irish mafia.
That sounds like a dangerous game.
but it also talks about that interconnectivity of how this is how it all crosses over. And so when you think about family dynamics, it's pretty interesting because it just the fact that they didn't immigrate and disappear into assimilation, right? They immigrated and they just have another place they're also living. Like there's very much still an interconnected community. So that's another side that's interesting about Irish literature is the that sense of homogen, stasis everywhere. There's even a song like I like to listen to Irish music, and
Hmm.
there's a one called I can't remember exactly what it's called, but there's an Irish pub in everywhere. So you can find an Irish pub in Kathmandu. There's two in Honolulu. There's one in I think there's two in Honolulu. There's one in Kathmandu. There's a bunch in Sydney. There's like some in Moscow. So the fact that it's talking about you can find an Irish pub, but in essence you can find Irish. Like the Irish are everywhere, and um, there's this community that will not go away because of the Irish pub, right?
And maybe you could even get help from them. Kind of like sometimes people think of the church, like wherever you are in the world, you could reach out to somebody and say, I need help, and they would respond to you.
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? That's how it comes up. So then you can get into other things like James Joyce is, a very popular Irish writer from the early, the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he was the one who starts to really shock people with writing. It's not that there's not tension in other Irish literature, but in Ulysses, like there's reference to and description of sex, and or talking about sex. So it becomes one of the first censorship cases in the United States in which the courts allow it to come in. So they actually protect what some people are considering to be scandalous pornography,
Yeah.
and but the judges involved are able to say no, this is it's actually
Part
literature.
of life.
Yeah. And there's the case that's super fascinating. I can't remember it at the point, but it also involves Irish racism. So the judge hearing the case says he makes this iconic statement inside the case law. He says the season was spring, and what do you say? The environment was Celtic or something like this. Like, he basically says, who these people are, and it's spring, so you can't expect them to not go into rut. Like it's almost like saying like, who doesn't have sex? But you can't. You have to especially understand that the Irish are going to have sex in the spring because they're animals. So the fact that the literature identifies, you know, something that everybody at some point in their population and species, like we have sex, or we wouldn't populate, right? We wouldn't, it wouldn't happen. But the way that the judge specifically allows for this to come in is that it was described accurately in that it aligned with his prejudice of Irish people being basically lusty people, particularly in spring.
All right.
So it wasn't untruthful. It wasn't written just for the prurient interest, which with pornography legally has to have like a prurient interest that is, it's not artistic in nature. It's kind of brutal, right?
Sensory. Yeah.
Yeah. So so James Joyce in Ulysses is like rocking the boat with this with this depiction of sex, and then now everybody reads the book because they're all like, well, I want to like, whoa, well, what's in there, right? But he also that's
Especially
another
when they label it as literature. You must read this for your class. Okay.
yeah. So that's what that then what becomes problematic is that it's banned in books and libraries, in colleges, because everyone's like, you can't read smut, and they're like, it's not smut. The court says it's actually literature.
The court says so.
Yeah, and it was funny because so it came in with a judge. So when it was first censored, it came in and one judge read it. On appeal, three judges read it. And one of the judges says, reading some of these passages numerous times. So you're like, you had to make good and sure it was not pornography. So, but you also see one of the judges who kind of saves the day, his name is Learned Hand, and his brother was I think one of the other judges, but he's identified as one of the most well-read judges in history. So like if you just read Learned Hand's um, decisions, like they're often very eloquent, they're often well written, and you can tell that he's read a lot of literature. So it was unfortunate for the initial judge that Learned Hand was going to be one of the judges because like he would have already had the predisposition to accept most things as literature just because he's such a well-read individual.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but anyway, there's another collection of short stories called The Dubliners, written by James Joyce, which are very funny and very fun, and some are sad, uh, because he takes like
What
Dublin.
kind of funny though? Are
Well,
you
like
talking? I mean, I know you read the, oh, it's Shakespeare stuff. What are those shorts? You were reading something and it was the kind of stuff I would object. I would be like, please don't torture me. I don't want to read this stuff.
oh no, these are James Joyce actually literally describes people really well. Like he just has such a very vivid
You
description of
would
people.
say that though about the Shakespeare stuff. I know you know what I'm talking about.
Well, I don't know, but what I know is that he just had it such a pulse on how to
Canterbury
describe.
Tales.
Oh yeah, the
That's
Canterbury.
Chaucer. That's not Shakespeare. See, ah, like talking to a history English buff. I just look so ignorant, but I got there.
Yeah, but I just finished the Canterbury Tales. I can't believe it was very long, but I did finish it.
I knew you were reading that.
Uh, but when you read the Dubliners, you really have a sense you're walking around this neighborhood that is very real. Like I don't know if it's real or not. Like I've never been to Dublin, but the
Have you been
the
to Ireland?
no, I've never been to Ireland. But but the way that he writes about the Irish people in the Dubliners, you're just like, wow, like it's very you can sense that it's real, right? Like there's alcoholism and domestic violence, which that's not uncommon. Like there's also just there's funny drunks, like that are actually funny. Like they say things that are really funny.
So
Like,
if you are interested in real people, that's entertaining.
yeah, and so if we kind of upgrade from that, then you read Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt, and it is the saddest book I've ever read. It is also the funniest book I've ever read because the guy is so poetic. Like he just makes some amazing sentences. Like he writes things that you're like, that is the most beautiful thing I've ever read.
Hmm.
And that was sad and it was funny. And it was because he talks about like being in Limerick. I believe that was the town he's talking about. And he says it's always raining. And so people would go to church. So they were just out of the rain. And but the way he describes it is like it was always wet, and so we went to church. I mean, it was I'm not even going to try to like character, but when I read that paragraph, it was so loaded because people thought they were spiritual and they were just trying to stay dry. But
Yeah.
it wasn't just about going to church to get out of the rain either. Like there's this sense of like they cannot escape their oppression and they just would like to be dry, right? They would like to escape the rain. They'd like to escape all these different things. And there's just such an overwhelming sadness, but yet there's this like ironic, optimistic, like humor about how sad it actually is. Like you can't make this stuff up type sad and happy, like and so like even though like things are just desperate and they recognize they should just be completely miserable, there's just also this almost hysterical laughing. Like who you have
It's
to
the
laugh
whole
at that.
paradox. Like you're always dealing in paradox in mediation where you have multiple things that are true at the same time that don't really make sense that
Yeah.
they're true at the same time.
And you have to like live with it. You have to sit in it, right? Like you can't deny Like I had a lady one time in the juvenile court where she was told, like the paper said she hit her child hard enough to make the eyes bulge out a little bit. Can you, I mean, that's a, I mean, like apparently the child's eyes went back in their head, but it was still kind of like, who
What?
recorded this? Like, yeah, what happened? And so I'm trying to represent this mother as I'm trying to help her like get her life together and get things together. I had no other description than I said, this says you bug bunnied your kid. You know, like it's like those,
Is that even possible to do? The
yeah,
description
like,
is so bizarre.
yeah, you hit your child hard enough that the eyes popped out and came back in like we would see in a Bugs Bunny counter, you know? She's like, what? I said, I'm just reading the document, you know, and I had to start laughing because and it's very serious, right? But I'm like, this is
Yeah,
what
you
I
must have hit
described.
him really hard.
I know. So when you read Frank McCourt, this is true. Like it is not fiction. So I mean, it's also a memoir, which I took a memoirs class, which says memoirs are not like they're not true. They are a person's impression of what they experienced,
Yes.
but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's accurate, right?
Dude, I want you to start writing books. You have done so much reading. The world needs a Travis book.
Yeah. Well, I am starting to write some books, so
Good.
yeah. But when you read McCourt, um, there's just this depth of amazing like tragedy and also just realism. Another thing that's interesting about migrant literature is that, and this is like across the board, and even you see it in family history all the time. So a person can be an Irish person, a Polish person, a Lithuanian person, a Greek, English, like anybody can come to the United States and they might be legal, they might not be legal, but they can join the army. And so, like Frank McCourt and his brother, they both joined the military, like as soon as they're old enough to join the military. And I think they're like maybe 18 or 17, 18, you know. And this is how they're providing for their family again. So they join the US military so they can send money back to Ireland to take care of their mother because their father died. Uh,
And they can provide money no other way.
well, it's one because of the prejudice against the Irish, because
People
they are
won't
state,
hire them.
yeah, people won't hire them, but they could join the military.
Okay.
Or if they do join, because he like McCourt was able to get other jobs, but he was also able to get other jobs, particularly once he came out of the military, because now he wasn't just Irish, he'd actually served his country.
Okay.
So there's other things that have to happen like that, right? Okay, so I'm gonna another lady who's really interesting. Her name is called I think it's called Ma Benchi. Benchi. Let me see if I can find one of her
How do you
books.
spell that?
Yeah, I was gonna see if I could see how to spell it.
Do we have any records by migrants, or are they just subsistence farming and they can't write anything? I mean, I don't
uh,
know if they're literate, but
what does that mean?
you're talking about migrant literature. Aren't they so busy working in fields or in the winter or at night do they write?
I put her name in, so it's Benchi, Maeve Benchi. It's in the chat. But so what'll happen is it's not often the migrant itself who's writing, it's their children who will write about growing
Oh,
up
yeah, yeah.
as because the children will often be sent to a work school potentially, and then they
Mm-hmm.
have to go out and work, or they'll be sent to a public school. Their parents are in
Yeah.
the fields or doing whatever. But Maeve is very fun. She writes. Um, it's different than James Joyce by way of the Irish community, but her community also kind of fluctuates between the United States, New York, New Jersey, Boston, and Ireland.
Mm.
And she writes very fun community literature. A thing that comes up in the literature also is the role of the church because particularly on the Catholic side, like the priest is like the mayor of the village. Even though there might be a mayor, it's like the priest in a lot of ways like controls a lot of things because of the role that the priest plays just in the spiritual leadership. But that leadership is huge. So she'll tie in stuff like that, but then she'll also bring in inconsistencies. Like there was one that was really cute. Like this lady who was going to college and trying to get her degree, and she couldn't make enough money on a side job, so she becomes a stripper so that she can actually make money. And then she marries a reputable husband after she graduates from college. So, but it's not unrealistic. Like the
No, it
way she,
isn't unrealistic. It's ridiculous that it is not unreal. Like, I was just wondering how many people put themselves through school that way, and it's
yeah, I even had a friend from high school who went to Vegas and was a dancer for a while. She says it was one of the most enjoyable jobs she had, and if you think
hey.
from when you think about morality, sometimes it's just like what context you're in and how do you set your mind so you get through stuff, right?
And it's good to have friends like that because it can be really hard to understand the perspective without someone sharing what it's actually like. You can make a lot of assumptions and it makes more sense to talk to someone.
Right. And she's like now a mortgage broker and is fine, right? Like she has a very fine lifestyle. So
Okay.
when you when you read Maeve Binchy, you have a sense of reality that blends things that are kind of like untouchable, and
Yeah.
she makes them like, yeah, you got to look at it. And like these are people and it like works out.
Yeah.
Um, when you also talk about Irish literature, you can't over you have to do the plays. So the two playwrights that stand out very strongly are George Bernard Shaw and Oscar Wilde. And Oscar Wilde also wrote A Picture of Dorian Gray, which was a great book. Um, his plays are also very enjoyable and funny. Like there's one that's pretty popular that has Colin Firth in it
The
called
importance of being earnest. Good job, me.
and the book's like the play's awesome. Like it's fun because it's just so funny. Like
That one is funny.
and it also talks about social classes. It also talks about how do you talk about the things you can't talk about. It also talks about how do we overcome our human desires versus our social classes, our economic goals, or our just our passions, or what does a word mean. He also struggled because he was homosexual. He did have a wife, but he had to struggle with his identity. So when you talk about A Picture of Dorian Gray and this picture that is able to kind of on the inside take all this damage and all this pain and all this suffering while the other person is able to go out and kind of live a public life, um, that definitely reflects some of the dilemmas of Oscar Wilde.
Yeah.
And he played both systems, right? So he's very Irish, but he's also kind of welcomed in the whole system because of how well he was successful. So he toured Europe, he toured England, he toured lots of places. George Bernard Shaw is a little different because most of the things he writes in his plays are actively charged to stimulate some rebellion. So,
I love that we're getting back to rebellion because I still want to talk to you about anarchy.
well, when you like at one point Bernard Shaw was a socialist. Um, but he writes My Fair Lady. It's
Oh, that's a good one.
but it's not called My Fair Lady. It's called Pygmalion.
Yep. I read it.
So
I
Pygmalion.
graduated with honors and they had a list of books and I picked the ones that I disliked the least. I
So
mean, I didn't know until I read them, but some of them I just picked because they were short, but I do enjoy that one.
okay, so his are really good because they are uh they are politically active.
Okay.
There's usually some sense of I should think about that when you read it, like you're kind of like wow, like that was uncomfortable, or where do you do with that?
Mhm.
Um, so I'm just kind of scrolling through some of my other books that. So I don't know. I guess as I go through that, there's also one called The Little Red Chairs. This is by Ed O'Brien.
Do you put them in your Goodreads by Italian, Irish literature?
Yeah, you could create a book like a shelf for that.
But do you?
Yeah,
Are you? Okay,
yeah,
so you're looking through a list that is all Irish.
correct at the moment. Yeah,
Okay.
and so like you have also guys like Pat Conroy, you know. So there's people who are of Irish descent, like Colleen McCullough. She wrote The Thornbirds.
How do you know that all these people are Irish? Do you search by
Yeah, you
some
can.
term?
Yeah, you can look up. You can go to Goodreads and look up Irish literature, and they'll give you a list. You can go to Wikipedia. They would also give you a list. Um, it all there's a variety. This is like the shallowest like footstep into Irish literature. Like there's lots of ways that you can find Irish literature. There's also Irish um, detectives. There's Irish like spy novels. There's Irish, thrillers, things that take place in Ireland that are thrillers in nature. Like uh I can't remember the last name of the guy is French, but he writes Irish thrillers. So they're not like I still think Stephen King like he writes the ultimate thriller. Like I
I
think
don't
he
know if I've ever read a Stephen King book.
it's
I know
it's
he's
def
popular.
it's definitely a thing of personal choice. Like you have to decide if you're in the mood. But if you
What's
want,
your favorite Stephen King book that's more PG? Like you're not gonna have nightmares till you die.
I truthfully, I did really enjoyed his he has a book on writing. I can't remember what it was, but it's nonfiction. And he talks about how he writes and how he became a writer. And his
That sounds
his
safe.
and his some of his issues with addictions. Like he had I can't remember, but some of his books he wrote totally like on cocaine, or I can't remember. I don't want to disparage him, but he was on something like cocaine or something, like on
Some
amphetamines or
substance.
that. He's like, I basically wrote my book through that period. And you can tell that he's dealing with demons, right? I mean, there's just I did read the Dark Tower series, which is not I didn't read the whole series. I read the first book. I like that because Stephen King does come up with some very um insightful things to think about. Like even though he's exploring stuff in just super unique ways, there is stuff in his books that you're like, wow, I just never thought of it that way. I just wouldn't have thought of it like that. But then when it comes to descriptions of stuff, he does not spare the rod. Like,
Okay.
like here's one of the realities in law school I realized the hard way by studying criminal law cases
Yeah.
that people who die with a knife in their back do not exist.
Okay.
Like it is nearly impossible to randomly kill a person with one knife stab.
Right. Okay.
And so when you see movies or things where that happens, that's generally thematic, like
License.
and like we don't have time to do it enough times. Like you can
Okay.
you can like it's possible that you could kill somebody with the throat or a heart, like if you're right on, right? But like there were cases where people were stabbed more than 60, sometimes into the like 100 times and they didn't die.
Ooh, well, that gives people hope if they're ever in a stabbing situation. Like, don't give up. You could live.
Yeah, I helped on a murder case. The lady who died 26, like stabbed 26 times.
Hey,
And the guy said, I just thought she would, like, he thought she would die sooner. And you're just like, what is happening? But so Stephen King knows that. So like, and I think his book is called
so he
Falling.
doesn't just do one knife stab. He does all the necessary stabs to kill you.
Yeah, but he's identifying the tension. Like that's part of the horror is that reality isn't one
Won't
knife
you
stab.
just die?
Yeah, reality is not one knife step. Like
Okay.
so, like there's this Falling Stars or something like this, a collection of short stories, and I started reading it, and I could not deny he's a great writer. Like as I was reading the build up to this scene in which a father and son kill their mother,
All right.
I I'm like, this is good writing. Like I could like he could tell
Some
the story.
people do that.
Yeah, but then when he started the process of killing them, I'm like, I can't take it. Like I cannot go through reality in every one of these like stories.
Yeah. Good. Good. At least you still have some sensitivity left after whatever criminal justice cases you're reading.
Yeah, they're sad stuff. But um anyway, I guess what I'm saying with Irish stuff is that if you try to like sometimes sit down and you say, I'm trying to understand the people through the literature. If you read one Irish book, there is no possible way you would understand the Irish people.
Yeah.
But if you say in your head, I'm going to read a collection of books and themes and like fiction, nonfiction, because I've read Irish fiction about like some of the Irish wars and stuff. And if you give both sides grace, right? You give the Irish and the Catholics and the Protestants grace. If you just give the Irish and the English grace, if you give the Irish Americans and the Ireland Irish grace, because you're just suspending judgment. Like you're just trying to say, I'd like to understand.
These
And
are all people and they all have similar interest in peace, success, happiness.
yeah, they all need to get their kids to school on time. They want to feed their kids.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And they're also coming from places that I haven't been. They're also coming from like magical places too. Like they're that like one of the books talks about believing one of the women in this modern day story, the O'Finnegan O'Reilly book, he believed the woman had fairy ancestry. So they called her Fae because she
Okay.
had kind of a second side, or she just was had like an intuitive spiritual insight. Like that's also part of like the real story. That's it's not they're not pretending like in a fanciful way that the person like there's actually a sincere belief that they could have fairy relatives. So to be able to kind of come from the perspective that I haven't even gotten into the, you know, because there was druid type concepts also in Ireland and Scotland and England. There's the Gaelic influence, but then there's also the when the Norwegians, you know, the Norse come in, the you know the Danish, the Vikings, like whichever system they came from, like they also had a huge impact on you know Ireland, Scotland, England. So it's just interesting to read literature that helps you understand why that identity is really important. Oh, and we haven't even talked about Darby O'Gill. So did you ever watch Darby O'Gill and the Little People?
I did watch Darby O'Gill and the Little People.
Yeah, so I
John Connery.
John Connery, that's right. So well, we could end with this. So the lady who wrote those stories went by H.T. Kavanaugh
Okay.
because she was a woman writer.
Right.
So she couldn't necessarily just write things under her
No,
name.
of course not. No one would read it
So
or publish it or buy it or good grief.
yeah, so her father was in the military in and was connected to a base called Aldershot. And so he
And
was
you
able,
remember this detail. Just in
so well,
awe.
I did family history for her. Like I kind of just tried to understand where she was coming from and learn more about her. So she came to the United States, and I believe her maiden name was Gibbony or Gibbony, McGibbony, and she marries Templeton. She marries a guy named Templeton, who is uh um like not a circus, but like he's a live entertainer. So that's pretty interesting, is that she marries a person who has like a traveling sideshow, Templeton. Like you can look him up. I'm like, oh my goodness. Then they get divorced, or he potentially dies. I can't remember at the moment. And then she marries the judge, Kavanaugh, and the judge is a Chicago judge. And this allows her to then
She
write.
doesn't marry regular guys.
Yeah. But then, and I don't know that she actually lived in Ireland very much. I mean, she later travels there, but she definitely studies. And then she starts to write the Darby O'Gill series.
Hmm.
And she writes a couple of collections of Darby O'Gill. Um, there's Ashes of Old Wishes, and then there's Darby O'Gill and the Small People, because they're either called Little People or Small People. Um, and they're the funniest stories. Like they are laugh out loud stories. Like
Okay.
there's one story in which a guy is supposed to go get a church bell, but he has a gambling problem.
Why
And
would you ever give him money?
his job was to go get the church bell. It wasn't to go get money.
No,
And
they gave him money to buy the bell, Travis.
no, so he was able to go, he went and got the bell, but then he meets the devil in the process, and they have a gambling game. They have a game of poker,
Okay.
and the sound of the bell is what the devil takes. So they put the bell in the tower, and the bell will not make, it will not dong. Like how clever is that? Like that is so clever.
That
But
is clever.
yeah, and then what happens is the priest finds out that something's wrong with the bell, the church bell, right? And so this is an example of the church, the priest coming in and kind of having to correct these things.
How does the he correct it? Do you have to read the story to find out?
Uh, he basically brings him into repentance, right? And like he gets it all figured out. Like I
Okay.
can't remember specifically, but the gist is the priest has the powers to unlock, and but
All right. There's some redemption possible.
yeah, but this guy who was supposed to go get the bell has to also repent and like get himself in alignment. And and then the priest can levy sanctions on him. Like I can't remember what they were, but Hail Marys and these different things. But then, he also has to just correct himself.
Stop
So
gambling with the devil. It's a bad plan.
yeah, then there was another one where Darby O'Gill is in a cemetery, and I cannot remember why he's in the cemetery, what's happening in the cemetery, but he's there and he believes that it's haunted, and all kinds of things are happening in the cemetery that are kind of examples of like just natural things that are perceived to be metaphysical, but
Okay.
there's this sense he's running all around the cemetery trying to get away from these things
Just leave
that,
the cemetery. Get
yeah,
out
like
there.
at one point he falls in a grave and he falls out of the grave.
Okay.
Yeah, but there's another book where he actually meets the king of the leprechauns, and
Yes.
and they have to kind of do these deals, and the king of the leprechaun has to be patient because at some points he has to pretend he's the baby in the carriage because Darby O'Gill's not going to let him go until he gets some other things corrected. And so I just thought, man, but that was one of my first kind of like conscious forays into Irish literature was in law school. I said, I think that these books are real. And so like I looked it up and realized that H.T. Kavanaugh like actually wrote real stories. They weren't just a movie. And so I went to the law library and I asked the law librarian to get in the interchange system, and they got me the Ashes of Old Wishes book. And then later, as things increased, as Google became popular, I got Google Books, and so Google, some of those stories exist in Google Books, and then
Mm.
now you can actually go to Amazon and buy some of the old collections. So I have a a work of Darby O'Gill stories that are
Oh.
recently published by a guy who got them out of like I think he bought the copyright or something, but he's basically reinvesting in Irish literature from the perspective of H.T. Kavanaugh. So she's being recreated, and but it's really a sense of if you look at this person who can't really write because she's a woman and Irish and has these things and has to hide behind HT instead of Hermione Templeton Kavanaugh, right? It's a very interesting story when you just start to explore um,
I
what
mean,
has
when
happened.
people catch on that anyone with initials is not a man, do any of, I guess some of the men do use the initials, but it's pretty common.
Yeah, so I mean it's not uncommon, but like George Eliot is a woman, and nobody ever said, who's that? So she's definitely not the only woman who had to try to figure it out.
Oh
Like,
yeah, that happened a lot.
yeah, even the lady who wrote not Pollyanna, Anna of Green Gables, like builds into her story how Anne is employed at a bookshop, and they told her she's not going to be able to publish because she's a woman. So she had to increase her. She had to like get enough readership and stuff out on her own that they said, "Oh, I guess yours is valuable."
Well,
So
you exceeded my expectations. I didn't know if there'd be anything to talk about in Irish literature, and apparently it's a thing.
I think it's really interesting. I think like with anything, like there's times where you have to be in the mood, like when I pick up African American literature, sometimes I'm like, man, this is going to be a rough story. Like there's very few African American stories that you're just like, oh, this is a no big deal read.
Yeah.
Like you usually have to be ready for some struggle.
Like
Um,
Holocaust stories, that kind of stuff.
yeah, Holocaust stories, you definitely have to be, okay, somebody's going to die. This is going to be bad. Um, but also there's this sense of like some populations right from the perspective of a certain voice. So there is a certain voice in in some African American literature that doesn't exist in all of it. So
Yeah.
it's surprising that when like Clarence Thomas, the justice on the Supreme Court, he doesn't write or speak like a civil rights activist, or so the voice of the literature that you sensed in like the Harlem Renaissance is not present with Clarence Thomas or some other African Americans who would be almost kind of like outside of the battle or the fight. Like if they were upper middle class and they just never identified necessarily as maybe even black, like they just don't even seem to like there's just a different voice, right? So you can sense sometimes in cultural writing a voice that is like the voice that people will write with also. Uh, so it's very, very unique. They're just interesting things to just play with. But I think it's interesting to not read anything from the perspective that it is true, but it's something that is part of the picture.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. There's no way you can understand the perspective unless you look at it.
Yeah, and you have to give it as much. just general allowance, right? Like you can't, you don't have to say it's true now. I have to totally embrace this opinion.
Yeah.
You could say it's interesting. I'm gonna think about this and see where, just see how it kind of melts and how it gravitates towards other stories and how other stories figure in. Because what ultimately, like in the law, one thing that is the most thing is you're not looking for everything to be truthful. You're looking for things just to start to align.
It's actually interesting now that you mentioned that, that you're playing the role of a judge and a mediator because they're a little bit different.
Yeah. But it instead of actually making ultimate decisions, if you're being a judge, you're ultimately just saying, am I weighing this correctly?
Hmm.
Because I would like, yeah, I agree that I come at it from a lawyer's perspective. So there's this idea of due process. Am I am I ultimately trying to give this enough weight that I understand it, that I'm giving it fair balance, that I'm hearing what's being said?
But I wonder what some of the orientation is between a judge that is a mediator or mediates regularly and one that doesn't
Yeah.
look
Well,
at
there's
both sides like that.
yeah, I totally agree. There's some judges that are horrible. Like if they were a prosecutor, they have a really difficult time coming
Mm,
out of that prosecutorial brain set
yeah.
when they are a judge, and you know that they hear their biases and their biases lead. So I do consciously try to not make any decisions from a bias.
Yeah. That's hard to do.
Yeah, I mean, but there's without question I have bias. I mean, but I guess when I'm trying to understand people, then I am definitely trying to suspend as much as possible, or relearn, or reset, or rethink my biases.
Hmm.
Because there's sometimes I'm definitely like surprised. Like, um, I was just at a Jewish convention or just at a Jewish synagogue the other day, and a Jewish woman said she does not agree with the Jewish government and the perspective of some of the Jewish kind of more radicals in the current conflict with Hamas because they just said they think the guy's a radical, like Netanyahu or whoever, you know. So even like if inside the community, the Jewish community, they're not all saying Israel just wins, right? It doesn't mean that means Palestine just loses or just wins either. It just gives you a sense where you can say that's an interesting, like that could be an anomaly, or am I paying attention, right? So then you can
There
just
are so many different pieces of that that you can't oversimplify that and make any type of understanding at all.
yeah. So then you just sit, like you just sit and you just say that's interesting information, right?
Yeah.
Because
You don't
it,
pretend like you can figure it out. That's just nonsense.
yeah, you don't say now I have the key to everything because this Jewish lady said so. Because
Clearly, I could, yeah.
yeah,
If I were the boss, I could fix it. No.
yeah. So anyway, it's been with Irish literature. I love it. Just I do have Irish in me. I have Irish grandparents. Um, I also have lots of Danish and English and German and French, but it is fun to kind of sense yourself in the struggle and where you're at, and so that's why I like Irish literature. And I hope that those are tuning in have had a good time with just this collective exploration in a fast nutshell.
I think it's been a great overview.
All right. Well, I hope that you'll find us on YouTube or on stewardgrowth.com. You can connect with our links, and we enjoy having everybody participate.